Today we are hosting a symposium on the occasion of the opening of Vincent Valdez's new body of work, The Strangest Fruit. The title of the symposium is the Strangest Fruit Symposium, and it will be exploring the history and ongoing resonance of the lynching of Latinos in North America. A general disclaimer, some of the topics and some of the images that you will be seeing as part of the symposium will be difficult. So for those of you who may find things uneasy, just to be prepared for those images as they may arise. Today we will have three speakers. We will have Muñoz Martinez speak first, followed by Daniel Hernandez, and then Vincent Valdez will conclude. After that, we will have a panel discussion where the three speakers will exchange views amongst themselves and have a conversation with the audience. Given the nature of the topic of the symposium today, we will have opportunity for questions after each speaker's presentation. So please do feel free, if you have a question, to raise your hand. We have two microphones in the audience, so please make your way to that microphone so that we will be able to hear the question and so that it can be a part of the recording and documentation of the conversations today. Our first speaker is Muñoz Martinez. Monica Muñoz Martinez is the Carlos E. Castañeda Postdoctoral Fellow in the Mexican American Studies for the 2012-2014 academic years. She earned her PhD in American Studies at Yale University and received her BA in American Civilization and Ethnic Studies from Brown University. Her research interests include Latino-Latina studies, ethnic studies, feminist theory, histories of violence in the United States, and the public humanities. While in residence in Austin, she is completing her manuscript, Inherited Loss, Reckoning with Anti-Mexican Violence, 1910 to Present. By analyzing court records, state archives, oral histories, and photographs, her manuscript addresses the intersecting nature of racial and gender violence in the early 20th century, particularly its continued impact on communities in the United States and Mexico borderlands. After completing the Castañeda postdoctoral fellowship at UT Austin, she will join the faculty in American Studies at Brown University. So we would like to preemptively welcome Monica to our community here and to begin our conversations today. Thank you.
Thank you. So excited to speak, I almost just jumped up on stage. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. It's a really beautiful afternoon, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we'll have at the end of this talk. I especially want to thank Ian for bringing me in from Texas and introducing me to Vincent. We had an excellent meeting in San Antonio at his studio where we actually talked for about 4 hours. And so to find a colleague who's interested in similar questions in such a weighty topic is pretty unique. So I'm thrilled to be sharing this work with you. Just to give you a sense of the discussion today that I'll be covering, I'm first going to start with a history of anti-Mexican violence to contextualize the casual circulation of Mexican corpses in the early 20th century. So I'll be giving you a sort of historical context to explain the social conflicts that were erupting at the early 20th century before I move into the photographic archives that I use for my own research. And then I'll finish up the talk by discussing the ongoing tensions in South Texas on the US-Mexico border, but in the United States in general, and a sort of failure to reckon with this period of anti-Mexican violence that has continued to influence the social relations in South Texas. So I'll be making connections to Valdez's work by also speaking about ongoing conflicts in Texas. My research grapples with the relationship between historical narratives, memory, and social relations of power. To explore these dynamics, I look at the history of violent conflict in Texas in the early 20th century between law enforcement agents, Anglo vigilantes, and ethnic Mexican residents. And these residents included both Mexicans that were American citizens and those that were Mexican nationals. There are long interconnected histories of racial violence in the United States that have yet to be fully reckoned with and explored in United States history. Lynched bodies are aptly here described as the strangest fruit, most importantly because histories of violence against Latinas and Latinos in the United States are not part of a national consciousness. Historians have documented that between 1848 and 1928, approximately 600 ethnic Mexicans were lynched in the United States, primarily in the Southwest. Almost half of this number were lynched in Texas. Those numbers, however, are exclusive to lynchings. Examinations of anti-Mexican violence, I argue, must think more broadly beyond studying vigilante violence alone to include conflicts between state agents, federal soldiers, and Anglo vigilantes collaborating in a practice of racial violence. If we look at the decade between 1910 and 1920, for example, we see the number of victims murdered by Texas Rangers, county officials, US soldiers, and Anglo vigilantes far exceeds this lynching statistic. It's estimated that approximately 5,000 ethnic Mexicans were murdered in this decade alone. These extralegal executions committed by vigilantes and state agents alike resulted in a decade that historians now recognize as a period of ethnic cleansing. So this really helps us to think about a culture of impunity in the early 20th century that impacted people so they were exposed to everyday forms of racial terror, right? So if we move beyond only thinking about vigilante acts, then we also see the way in which the state creates a culture of impunity for these actions. So just to give you a sense, today we'll be traveling to South Texas. I'll be referring to El Paso, which is over here on the far west corner of the state, bordering both Mexico and New Mexico, and also Brownsville, which is the southernmost city in Texas, far at the bottom. And just to give you a better image of Brownsville, this is a map of the Rio Grande that divides Brownsville from the Mexican city Matamoros. And so this line that you see connecting them is actually the US Railway, which arrived in Brownsville in 1904. And the far right-hand corner of Brownsville is also a wider spot that is Fort Brown, and that will be brought up in our conversation as well. So for some more historical context, in the late 19th century, processes of fencing in private property rapidly reorganized the landscape in Texas. The year 1874 signaled the mass distribution of barbed wire. This practice of fencing stifled ideals of land use practiced by Mexican rancheros living in Texas, which led to a sweeping reorganization of Anglo-Mexican relations. And this is my favorite photograph of barbed wire in Texas. This is a ranch in West Texas. By the 20th century, Mexicans in Texas were no longer primarily a landowning class, but instead overwhelmingly relegated to manual agricultural labor, giving rise to the popular Mexican saying, "Con el alambre vino el hambre." With the barbed wire came hunger. And here you really see that, Texas and West Texas is especially a very vast area, and so the barbed wire is not only demarcating space, but is really regulating the movement of the cattle here, which led to that shift in racial, there's a little hole here, got it. That really shifted the racial hierarchies. And so what ends up happening is that there's a demographic shift, not only with the industrialization of Texas in the early 20th century, in which Anglo farmers from both the South and the North come. And so there's a shift in racial hierarchies and a shift in class hierarchies that really increases racial tensions in the early 20th century. These racial tensions were then exacerbated by the start of the Mexican Revolution in 1910, which initiated widespread political instability in Mexico, and a fear of Mexican bandits crossing into the United States resulted in a surge to militarize the Texas-Mexico border. By 1915, approximately 1,000 Texas Rangers spread throughout the countryside with the goal of eliminating Mexican bandits. And likewise, over 100,000 US soldiers arrived in South Texas to police the region. So you really have this militarization of South Texas occurring in the early 20th century as a result of the Mexican Revolution. And so there's a rhetoric and a fear of the Mexican Revolution crossing into Texas, and also a fear more specifically of the Mexican bandit. And so the sheer volume of soldiers and rangers policing the borderlands is staggering, but their methods for policing the border is most important. As a means for securing the border, in 1915, Governor Ferguson ordered Texas Rangers to eliminate Mexicans in South Texas. With this order, the governor promised to use his pardoning power whenever necessary. And so this militarization then was also coupled with state sanctioning extralegal violence. During this period, the rhetoric of a social crisis and imminent danger created a culture of brutal aggression at the hands of law enforcement agents. Agents profiled anyone who looked Mexican as a potential bandit or bandit sympathizer, and they used their shoot first, ask questions later methods liberally. One Ranger Captain, Henry Ransom, for example, took his shoot first mentality to access as he reportedly exclaimed, "A bad disease calls for bitter medicine." One local sheriff noted that the Texas Rangers in this period acted simultaneously as trial judge, jury, and executioners. So in other words, during this period, justice took the form of state officers or a vigilante wielding a Colt 44 revolver. This criminalization of Mexican men then led to rampant violations of both social and civil rights, most specifically the right to judicial procedures. And so just by profiling somebody as Mexican, that was grounds for summary executions during this period. If we think about the history of actually photographing Mexican corpses, it's important to remember this period, or this genre, really, that I found within the two historical contexts of photography. Not only the photography of war that develops in the 19th century, but also the photography of lynchings. During my research, it took about 5 years to develop a collection or to create a collection, to amass it from visiting university archives and rural archives throughout South Texas. And what I've acquired is about 75 photographs of Mexican corpses that were taken by 3 different photographers living in Texas at the early 20th century. As an archive, these photographs and postcards offer a visual narrative of racial conflict, and they give us access to perspectives of photographers at the time, but also to the commodification of Mexican death. So why do these photos exist? As I explained, they're part of these two genres of photography coalescing. The rise of amateur photography began in the 1890s at the same time that the increasing number of lynchings rose at a devastating pace in the American South. Between the 1880s and 1930s, the practice of photographing some of the over 3,000 black men and women who were lynched by Anglo mobs became a popular practice. By selling and circulating these images, photographers ensured that the moment of racial terror survived long after the event and continued to reassert racial terror in the American South. These photographs were thus both a bonding mechanism for those who shared these images and a continued method of racial intimidation. Now, the first war photography that really developed in the mid-19th century included the US-Mexico War in 1846 through 1848. However, these photographs of this conflict in Mexico were primarily used for newspapers, and so there was a circulation of information about the battles in the war and who was ahead, and those photographs usually focused on the atrocities of war. But by the 20th century, amateur photographers and entrepreneurs began documenting the atrocities of war for profit. This included in this group were men like Robert Runyon, for example, who settled in Brownsville in 1909 and opened a portrait studio. Other photographers like Otis Altman, Walter Horn moved into Brownsville, places like Brownsville, El Paso, and also Eagle Pass, the smaller border towns that directly neighbored Mexican cities across the border where there were military conflicts ongoing. And they started postcard companies to document this conflict of the Civil War in Mexico. The war provided a lucrative subject for American photographers as the eruption of the revolution coincided also with the golden age of the picture postcard. So by 1910, what you also see is the development of this market for picture postcards, and by 1910, American consumers were buying and sending to their relatives upwards of almost 1 billion postcards a year, right? So there's also a market for these types of images, not only for newspapers, but also for popular consumption. Walter Horn, the owner of the Mexican Postcard Company, is credited with making the most money from selling photographs throughout the United States and even in Europe. By 1914, he had sold more than 30,000 postcards for about 2.5 cents each. But his biggest customers were actually the 40,000 American soldiers stationed at Fort Bliss near El Paso. He noted, quote, that the most gruesome photos sold even better. And in his collection, his most profitable were actually photographs that he paid Mexican generals permission to photograph executions. And I'll be showing you one of those later in the presentation. Photographers of the Mexican Revolution also turned their cameras north of the Rio Grande. Photographing Mexican corpses in Texas also became a profitable subject for photographers. In this context, then, the photography of Mexican corpses, again, lies at the intersection of these histories of war photography, because these photographers are making profit of Mexican corpses that are victims or casualties of the Civil War in Mexico, but they're also looking at the mob violence in South Texas, right? So if you think about those two genres of photography, it makes perfect sense that they would turn their cameras north and actually document that violence. These photographers created visual narratives that represented this period as a process of border pacification. US soldiers and Texas Rangers are profiled as heroic examples in these images of white masculinity, while ethnic Mexican males are denigrated with labels such as bandit, greaser, and prisoner. And so this binary that you see in these photographs and newspaper articles that were published helped to justify the violence and to make it more palatable for audience members. And it also, of course, relied on the soldiers at Fort Brown, who gave some of these photographers ample business because they staged their own photos for their own personal use to send to their family members. And so just to give you a sense of some of these photographs, in the collection that I put together, there are dozens of photographs of the forts and of soldiers actually running drills. And so I'll show you in a sense of how these images linked the militarization of the border to actually the taming of the Southwest, right? And so that you see that residents who are interested in moving to the Southwest but who are nervous about being so close to Mexico are purchasing images like this to convince them that this is a regulated space. And so here, this is one of the images of cavalry soldiers at Fort Brown. And so again, you see the way in which the camp itself is regimented, the landscape looks disciplined. And here is one of the images of soldiers practicing military drills. And this was a popular topic, especially because by the time you get to 1915, there's talks of the United States joining World War I. And so you also see these soldiers not only performing drills so that they can police the border, but so that they're also prepared for actually entering World War I. And so in soldier memoirs, they actually don't reference fighting against Mexicans at all, but that this is training for them for later battles. In that same line, this is an image of technology. So there was an emphasis in postcards that were sold that emphasized the new technologies that were being used on the US-Mexico border, again, to be taken abroad. And so this is one of the searchlights that was used to police the banks of the river. And then this next image that I'm going to show you is also an example of some of these postcards being color chromed. And so it's the black and white photos that sometimes were sold as postcards, but they were also enhanced. And so this is actually a postcard from the Robert Runyon collection. And he, in particular, loved taking pictures of the new tanks and of the machine guns that these soldiers were using. And so here at the bottom, I don't know if you can read it, but this is a Vickers Maxim watch-cooled machine gun. And this is originally black and white that was enhanced for circulation. Okay, so moving on. Aside from these photographs of the Mexican soldiers, there were also dozens of photographs of US soldiers who were casualties, either during infantry drills or in actual conflict. In some instances, they were actually going into Mexico to try to seek out some Mexican bandits. And so in these moments, you see that there's also an instruction by the photographers to honor US soldiers who made sacrifices. And so this is an example of a funeral procession for a US soldier who died, and this is in Brownsville. And so you see the residents of Brownsville coming to pay their respects. This is actually for 3 soldiers. And so here you see the parade, the caskets draped in the American flag and covered by flowers. In this image, you see the caskets that they're prepared to be loaded onto the train. And so this is the railroad depot in Brownsville. And here also at the bottom where you see the inscription, the triple funeral, in these moments when Robert Runyon and other photographers actually inscribed text onto the negative, it's a signal that that was most likely turned into a postcard. These favorable photographs of US soldiers stand in stark contrast to photographs of Mexican casualties of the Mexican Revolution and victims in Texas. Collections contain photographs of lynched Mexican men, decomposing corpses, and prisoners lined up prior to being executed. And like I said, especially Walter Horn, who was working out of El Paso, paid great amounts of money so that he could have access to some of these executions. This is an example here. This is an execution. Okay, this is Robert Runyon. He took this photograph in Matamoros. So as I told you, he was a resident of Brownsville. He had a portrait studio there. And when there was a great battle in Matamoros and the federal soldiers actually lost the city to revolutionaries, some of the federal soldiers were executed. And so this is one of those photographs. I actually found the postcard for this negative. And so this is where you see it being color chromed. And I actually stumbled upon this postcard in a collection of souvenir postcards for Brownsville, Texas. So this is seated right next to a postcard of citrus groves in Brownsville and of the public school in Brownsville and City Hall of Brownsville. And so you really see the way in which there's the sort of, these images are seen as culture and life of Brownsville, the sort of ways in which Mexican death is not seen as something that should be mourned, right? I mean, this is something that's seen sort of as a voyeuristic look into casualties of war, and when we look at some of the images later, they become more gruesome. The photographs of executions, as well as those with American soldiers grinning while posing with dead or wounded Mexican prisoners of war, also grew in popularity. These images frequently relied on the derogatory labels greaser or bandit to mark the dead bodies. In many of these photographs, such as one titled "The Body of Mexican Bandit Leader," the Mexican prisoners of war lay surrounded by US soldiers who smile at the camera as they hold up their victim. In similar images, the corpses are bound by rope, some are disrobed with their genitals in view, or simply covered with a blanket. The titles, captions, and descriptions label the dead as bandits, thieves, or greasers deserving of summary execution. And so in most of these images, especially when they label somebody a Mexican bandit leader or a Mexican bandit, there's an overwhelming assumption of guilt. This practice of criminalization restricted viewers from feeling sympathy for the victims. Moreover, this racialized labeling justified extralegal executions and instructed viewers to celebrate the violence by joining the soldiers in their voyeuristic delight. Photographs of soldiers frequently show that these corpses were mocked, desecrated, in some they were molested, and in some cases some of these victims were dismembered. And so I'm also layering onto that in the history of lynching photography in the South, there's also examples of sexual violence against victims. And so this is something that was rampant throughout the Southwest as well. And the theme that Gorse sold, as Walter Horn pointed out in the earlier quote that I read, today I'm going to show a minimal amount of the images because I think they are so gruesome. But there are collections of dozens of photographs of piles of bodies that are victims or casualties of the Mexican Revolution. And they're especially startling when those piles of bodies are not victims of a war, but they're placed in South Texas. One of Walter Horn's photographs captures approximately 15 bodies piled on top of one another. Arms, legs, and torsos intermingle and seemingly impossible to disentangle. Their individuality and humanity are reduced to limbs in a pile. What is clear, however, is that the image was reproduced and made into a postcard for consumption and distribution. In 1918, a U.S. cavalry soldier stationed in West Texas bought and mailed this postcard to his mother, Mrs. Ruth Fairbanks in Emmett, Kansas. The soldier with the initials RFK casually wrote to his mother with no reference to the deceased on the front. Instead, he composed a mundane sense of the border. He wrote, "Feeling pretty fair, the weather is fine here, and pretty warm." And this postcard is just one example, again, of the casual circulations of these Mexican bodies. And here I think what's interesting especially is that he, as a soldier, is referencing to his mother his own well-being without taking into account or even referencing the more than a dozen men that are piled in a photograph on the front of this postcard. Now I want us to move away from not only the photographs of the Mexican Revolution and how these casualties of the Mexican Revolution, those images were circulated, but to also look at the vigilantes and the photographs, or the victims of state agents as well in Texas. When photographers turned their lens towards violence in the United States, they regularly documented victims of extralegal executions. For example, photographer Robert Runyon captured the most infamous image of state violence in South Texas during this period. On August 8, 1915, some 60 men raided a flag station at Las Norias section of the King Ranch. And just to give you a sense, the King Ranch was known in this period as the greatest symbol of an Anglo domination. It's essentially a ranching empire. At its peak in 1920, the King Ranch had over 2 million acres of property. Just to fence in the ranch with barbed wire took 2,000 miles of barbed wire fence. And so if you just want to imagine how great this ranch is, you can extend 2,000 miles of barbed wire from the ranch itself in South Texas, and it will reach Providence, Rhode Island. Right, so just to police a ranch of that magnitude required for the ranchers to bring in U.S. soldiers and Texas Rangers. And so they actually had a headquarters stationed on the Las Norias section, the division of the ranch. And so this is an image of the headquarters. And so here, there's U.S. cavalry soldiers on the deck. There's some Texas Rangers and also some ranchmen, but the headquarters is also connected by the railroad for easy access. This is a photograph of about 6 U.S. soldiers, and again, in terms of the labeling and the contrast between the treatment of U.S. soldiers and Mexican bodies, here you see that they're labeled 6 defenders of Norias. And so these were actually the soldiers who were on site on the raid of August 8 in 1915. The attack on the ranch on August 8 then was an attack on the most well-guarded piece of private property and a symbol of Anglo supremacy. Local and state officials ordered swift retribution. One former soldier, I don't know which he is, but one of these soldiers is Sergeant Allhands, and he wrote a memoir of his time at the border. When he was recalling the memoir, he wrote that rangers and vigilantes who were present seeking retribution for this raid were, quote, a savage radical element. He continued to explain that in response to this raid and others, quote, glaring abuses and retribution and threatenings to clear the Valley of Mexicans was apparent. So it's also important to remember that not all soldiers in this period supported these actions, but what he documents is a systemic manhunt that the Rangers and U.S. soldiers and some Anglo vigilantes took in retribution of this raid. And he totaled that at the end of little more than 2.5 weeks, 102 Mexican men had been murdered, right? And so even if you total that they estimate that 60 men came to raid the ranch, they totaled that they murdered in revenge 102 Mexican men. Robert Runyon availed himself to photograph some of the carnage. He took 8 pictures of 4 Mexican men who were assumed to be bandits and connected to the raid on the King Ranch. This series included 3 photos of the corpses alone on the Texas landscape and 5 with different arrangements of state agents posing with their victims. And this is the image that I'm about to show is really an iconic image of the violence of the Texas Ranger, and I've been able to trace its circulation throughout the 20th century. So here you see the Texas Rangers. Over here on the left is Captain James Monroe Fox. On the far right is Captain Ransom, who I quoted earlier as saying, a bad disease calls for bitter medicine. And I haven't been able to place the man in the middle. I know the names of the Rangers and the soldiers who were present, and I believe that might be Sheriff Vaughn, who was a sheriff in Hidalgo. And so here, what's especially disturbing is that these Rangers have their ropes tied to these Mexican men, and it looks as if they're being dragged around the property. So this is the photograph that's been circulated the most widely. It was made into a postcard, and it was a celebration of the progress that these Rangers were making in eliminating these quote-unquote bandits. This next image that I'm going to show here is a shot without the Rangers present. You again notice that the men are labeled as dead Mexican bandits, where that label itself recognizes an assumption of guilt. It here is restricting the viewers from feeling sympathy for these men, right, in that criminalization. But it also helps to justify the mistreatment of the bodies. And so in the early 20th century, when there is a rhetoric of a social crisis and fear at the hands of Mexican bandits, these images help to justify their mistreatment. But this label also closes the door for assumptions of innocence of these men, right? And so that sort of criminalization is swift. Something else that I'll note is that in the picture that I showed you before, what you'll notice is that the victim on the far left, in this image, his leg is straight. In this previous image, you can see that it looks like he's been, from being drugged, his leg is pulled back. And so there was also, this image came into evidence in 1919 when there was a Senate investigation into the Texas Rangers. And so a local Texas state representative from Brownsville brought this photograph into evidence to show that the atrocities of the Texas Rangers were rampant. And so when he was interviewing one of the ranch hands who witnessed this act, the ranch hand tried to say, "You've got it wrong, that these Texas Rangers were removing these bodies. This was not a celebration of their death. This was not an abuse of their power." And Texas State Representative Canales was able to silence this witness from justifying this as Texas Rangers just removing the bodies by asking, is it common for Texas Rangers to pull a load with their horses backwards, right? I mean, of course, the logic, if you're moving somebody, your horses are advancing forward. The other thing that, if we look at these images, this is the men from a horizontal view. You also notice that one of the third victim here, from the bottom, the second, is facing the Texas Rangers when they're standing to the left of this image. And so what you realize also is that he was being drugged from the neck. which is tough to see. And this is not an image that was circulated. So of the 8 images, only the first that I showed you, I've been able to find in postcard form. The iconic photograph of these Anglo men mounted on horseback, overlooking the corpses of ethnic Mexican men lying on the ground and tied to horses by rope, etched the Texas Ranger practices into popular memory. The photo brought celebrity to the Rangers in the circulated photographs. Captain Hanson, 1919, observed, quote, "The ranchers were quite satisfied with the work of Captain Fox in teaching the river Mexicans a lesson." 3 years later, Texas Ranger Captain James Monroe Fox, over here on the left, instructed Rangers of Company B to execute 15 ethnic Mexicans in front of the women, children, and elderly men who lived in West Texas ranching community of Porvenir. This event is known as the Porvenir Massacre of 1918, and it again reminds us that some of these Texas Rangers and U.S. soldiers had long careers as Texas Rangers, and so the men that they participated in murdering was quite large. In terms of thinking about how to reckon with these images and these legacies, what I want to talk about, just very briefly as a method or as a way of concluding, is that in popular history in Texas, this period has overwhelmingly been erased and forgotten in public settings and official settings. So if we think about the Texas Ranger Museum, this is the Bob Bullock Texas History Museum in Austin, Texas. And they have a grand exhibit on the history of barbed wire and the history of ranching, and there's no mention of this period of violence in Texas at all, and it's a 3-story building. So there's a clear erasure of this period. If we look at the history of the Texas Rangers, here, this is the official museum in Waco, Texas. There's also an elimination of this history and the violence that Texas Rangers participated in. Perhaps more disturbing is a recognition that the violence, especially practiced by James Monroe Fox, actually continues to be celebrated today. And so, particularly for his participation in the Porvenir Massacre of 1918, this is the cover of a magazine for the Department of Public Safety in Texas. And on the bottom, you see that the article "Death on the Rio Grande" is actually a celebration of James Monroe Fox's long career on the border. And there's a special interest piece on his gun. So his Colt 44 revolver was identified by a gun collector, and so there's a piece on that in this magazine that was published in 1996. His story has also been celebrated by gun fanatics in Texas, and so this is also another story on Captain Fox's Colt 44 revolver. And then there are places like this in Sabinal, Texas, which is 80 miles west of San Antonio. In Sabinal, there is an exhibit honoring the history of the Texas Rangers. And as you leave the Dairy Queen with your ice cream cone or your cheeseburger, there's also 2 photographs of lynchings. And so it's got this celebration of the Texas Ranger and their long history, their headquarters in Sabinal in the late 19th century, but also a very casual circulation of 2 photographs of a lynching, without marker, without recognition that they're even present. But aside from these casual circulations of these images, the public forgetting, the official forgetting of this history of violence, and the celebration of this history and violence are in tension with local residents who today are trying to memorialize this period and reckon with this history of violence. Historians are now thinking about more expansively racial history in the United States, and so one example here is the Revolution in Texas by Benjamin Johnson. and this is should be a familiar image now. The editors for the press decided to use that iconic photo on the cover, which he was against, but they compromised so that the corpses of the Mexican men weren't included. And this photograph is also, he's critical of this period of violence, right? But this image appeared again on the website of Hernan Contreras, whose grandfather and great-grandfather were murdered by Captain Ransom in 1915. And so he's done his own archival work, his own memorialization. He has a digital archive of his family history of that event, but he also has this section on the border wars, that decade between 1910 and 1920. And so he's really trying to expose the violence at the hands of the Texas Rangers. But what I think, interestingly enough, more interesting, is that he's actually also juxtaposing those images of the Texas Ranger from the Runyon collection with his telling of the murder committed by Captain Ransom, and then he includes the biographies of the surviving family members, right? And that signals for us a need to not only focus on the dead corpses, but on the communities that were impacted by those killings. And so if we think about the two widows in his family and the children who survived in the aftermath of that campaign, he honors those families, and his cousin, Norma Rodriguez, to really attempt to memorialize their death, she publishes poems on the anniversary of their murder. And so this is just to give you a sense. In my research, I'm not only interested in archiving and narrating a history of violence in the early 20th century, but then thinking about the aftermath and how communities responded to these acts of violence, and then tracing the generational practices of re-narrating these histories, critiquing public amnesias about this history of violence. And then now, 100 years later, what you're seeing are people who are generations removed with access to the internet and with access to resources in their communities, creating their own memorials. And so on the 100-year anniversary, we're starting to see that there's a mobilization by some of these relatives to actually reach out to each other and build conversation. And I think one of the most compelling things about the artist Vincent Valdez's work is that it creates an opportunity for these dialogues to occur, but also for pieces that provide an opportunity to mourn and reckon with these histories. So I'll stop there, and we have time for just a few questions. If there's any questions about the presentation before we move on, about any of the images. Yeah?
Great talk. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I have so many questions, but I'll try to limit myself to two of them, so I won't disagree. First of all, having spent my childhood in Texas and having had all my primary education in Texas, I can tell you, I never got this growing up in Texas at all. We had student on Indians, and that was about it. But two questions. Number one, and maybe the harder one, is like, why were the pictures that were the most recent celebrated? That's that one. But the other one is, I just want a little bit more background, because the story you tell is a story that we see a lot in terms of enclosures and pushing people off the land and sort of capitalism coming in. And I noticed that in that last sort of initiative, the penultimate one, that you had the picture of the men who were murdered, that he was a landowner. So if you can give me some more background about who was murdered, why, also what was happening, why these people were being pushed off the land, what were they doing to resist, say, the King Ranch or what have you, talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you. It's a great question. Well, in terms of looking at the different events that I study in the manuscript, there's a number of reasons why different individuals were targeted. And so in some case, it was a casual encounter with a ranger or a U.S. soldier in the vicinity of an area where maybe a raid occurred. And so in most cases, they were innocent bystanders. But particularly in counties like Hidalgo County, where there was a landed Mexican elite, and Mexicans or Tejanos rather, who were active in politics. This is an image of Antonio Longoria. He was actually, he was a school board member he at one point was a deputy in Hidalgo, and so he and his father-in-law were targeted because they were about to be witnesses in a land dispute case. And so one of their ranching neighbors was actually having a hearing to try to reclaim property that was being taken by an agricultural company, right? And so they were fighting to protect their property, and so the family members also believed that it was because they were active in politics. And so they were parts of a political machine that really encouraged Mexicans to be voting. And so when you see the industrialization in the early 20th century, you not only see that shift in racial hierarchies, but there's also the integration of Jim Crow segregation. And so the majority of the Anglo farmers who moved in the early 20th century are moving from the South, but also from the North. And so in those counties like Hidalgo that were further south, where Mexicans were able to maintain some social power, there was a very active attempt to really eliminate those political leaders. And so from the massacre that I described in 1918, it was a Mexican ranching community that was the first to successfully irrigate the land in West Texas in the desert. And so they actually had a very profitable cotton crop. And so with the 15 men being eliminated, the Mexican widows, some of them fled to Mexico, others moved to other parts of the state, but they abandoned their land. And so, it's a web of reasons. And so in the different case studies, I sort of parsed that out, but it was a mix of people being profiled, and then in some cases, they were very targeted murders. Mm-hmm.
I noticed in your talk that you really limited the number of violent images that you showed us, and I'm wondering if that was for us to be, PG audience, or a more conscious decision.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. I have 4 versions of this presentation, and this is the one that I settled on today. Especially some of the photographs of the piles of bodies. I'm very conflicted about showing them, knowing that they were photographed for consumption and they were photographed for profitable markets. And so, I think that I can make the argument that there's a criminalization of these men that justified, and that there's a casual circulation and a dehumanization that takes place in this market without having to show so many of them. I'm actually going through that process now with colleagues to think about which pictures I'll publish. I think especially some of those postcards that show U.S. soldiers in action in participating in the violence against these corpses. I'll have 1 or 2 of those, but I don't, I'm interested in some of the work by, there's an art historian and artist, Ken Gonzalez-Day, and he has done some work also with photographs in removing the corpses of lynched bodies from these older photographs. And so I think that I'll show some of those or have some of those in the book. But I think that I'm very wary of using these photographs for spectacle, and really walking, thinking about that line of using them for an educational purpose to say that these archives are there. And so that's also, but I also realize that in narrating and describing these photographs, right, that doesn't get away from engaging with them directly. So yeah, what I've done is limited my public circulation in these talks and these formats with somebody like Vincent. I shared my collection with him. But it's certainly, and there's also a policing of these libraries and the archives themselves. So there are some archivists who don't, want anyone making copies of these photographs, particularly in these local communities and some public museums like in Marfa and in Alpine. They didn't want me having photographs of some of the pioneers of their counties standing next to lynched bodies. And so, so that's also, another side of the need to show some of these images. And so, yeah.
I just have one follow-up question. I wonder if you think at all about the need to show some of the violent imagery next to these kind of heroic or iconicized images of the Texas Rangers, and if there's a need to not only contextualize those photos with written word, but also sort of with the contrast of the violent images, especially the soldier images without dead bodies, the training grounds and stuff like that. There's a need to kind of...
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mean, I think the possibilities for how to show these ethically and responsibly are great. I could imagine, I mean, just for hours thinking about curating an exhibit that shows the participation of U.S. soldiers with racialized other bodies that are being mocked and desecrated, right? That I found evidence of this in the 19-teens, but you could chart a whole genealogy through World War II, and the humiliation and the desecration of Japanese soldiers, also in Vietnam. I mean, there's a long, and most recently in Abu Ghraib, right? There's a long history of U.S. soldiers participating in photography of this genre, and I think that there's a need for a sustained conversation. In terms of some of the photographs that I showed today and others that I have in my collection, I'm working with some other historians to actually have a symposium in 2015 to mark the 100-year anniversary of the peak of violence, and so we're actually working with different curators and museums in Texas to find the appropriate avenue. The Texas Ranger History Museum is a for-profit museum that celebrates the Texas Rangers, and they want nothing to do with the conversation. The Bob Bullock, yeah, it's shocking. The Bob Bullock Museum in Austin is also for-profit, and we're starting to have those conversations. But unfortunately, the academic archivists and curators are the most amenable to these conversations, and so we're having conversations with not only with these relatives, but also different residents in Texas to organize memorials and actual historical memorials that are sanctioned by the state of Texas is something that most of these relatives ask for. So in asking what is it that you want, or what would a real reckoning look like, they want the state of Texas to recognize that their governors and their agents participated in these crimes. And so in getting back to an earlier question of how people responded, families responded by maintaining their ownership in their property. In some cases, they collaborated with Mexican consulates to seek grievances against the United States. And so that collection of widows that I described from the Bonita massacre, they actually filed a claim through the General Claims Commission and sought indemnities for the role of U.S. soldiers in these crimes. And so for some families actually being able to see these photographs, what the hardest part is actually identifying who the victims are, right? There's a culture of anonymity that is difficult to distinguish who these victims are. And so I haven't seen an occasion where they could be used as evidence in a particular case, but there's need for an important dialogue about their role in public education. Absolutely. Yeah.
That was a great talk, and I was just thinking, looking at these the series of photographs and hearing you speak, made me think about the long history of artists and photographers who expose the horrors of war, whether in paintings, like or Prince, Hello, or Goya, or Manet, or Matthew Brady, and I was just wondering whether in terms of circulation of these photographs, you said they have a very wide circulation. Did they circulate a lot outside Texas? And as far as you know, is there evidence of any artists or photographers who looked at these images and responded to the horror of them?
That's an excellent question. Sorry, I'm really moving around these cords. I don't know. I mean, this is actually for me a really interesting phenomenon that this topic is being taken up by current artists. This period of violence was particularly mobilizing for activists during the civil rights movement, and so Chicano and Chicana activists talked about histories of lynchings and stories that they had learned through generational circulation of these memories of different events. But because these photographs, after they were circulated, they were really mailed mostly from soldiers to family members or from visitors to Brownsville to other friends. And so they're mostly in people's private collections. And so the first image that I found actually of US soldiers by one of these piles of corpses was in the Beinecke Library here in New Haven at Yale University. And it was someone's private collection of memorabilia from Texas. And so they had about 40 photographs of these postcards from that genre. And so there were private collectors, but in terms of seeing a direct influence of these photographs and influencing artists, I haven't seen that. I mean, Vincent Valdez's work is inspirational for actually being, what I see is the first to tackle this topic, and most importantly, for not identifying a specific apparatus, right? Because if anything, I think that the threads that I see in my own research is that this is a state-sanctioned approach to violence against ethnic Mexicans, and that thread continues throughout the 20th century, and so it becomes harder and harder to find the mechanisms that are practicing violence against racial groups, right? And so now we see high rates of incarceration, we see practices of putting minorities on the front lines of wars, and so tracking that system of power and how it condoned making brown bodies especially vulnerable to forces of violence becomes harder and harder to trace. And so, in a sort of long roundabout way, no, I haven't seen these photographs in particular influencing artists to think through them aside from more current threads. Yeah. This hole here.
First of all, thank you for your insight and research. Great. I guess my question for you is if you could talk briefly, or if you address this in your work, about applying this history of violence to cultural identity, because it seems like the actions of the Texas Rangers was an attempt to, for the first time, develop, a Texas identity for Texas people. You spoke of mass consumption of these images in an attempt to emphasize that. So I'd like to know what you think about that, and also what it means about what it means for contemporary Chicanos and Latinos living in Texas, and the sense that since Texas was created, being Texan means accepting these images, or means accepting that you're not Mexican. Mm-hmm. So, and what that means in terms of a paradox for someone who, comes from Mexico.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so you're asking, cultural identity and how this informs it. Well, I think one of the quick things in terms of creating a Texan identity, you really see that starting to be developed in the early 20th century. And so the Daughters of the Texas Revolution, just to give you a quick example, they take ownership of the Alamo in San Antonio in the 19-teens. I think it's in 1914. And and what they really celebrate, they create one of the most iconic monuments, right, that really solidifies that dichotomy of Anglo hero and Mexican villain, right, in the story of the Alamo, right, that we don't necessarily glorify or memorialize the battle in which Texas, in which there was a defeat of Santa Anna, but we remember the treacherous Mexicans who murdered those who were trying to fight for justice and democracy, right? And so that being the seed of the development of a Texan identity, and that really picking up steam in the early 20th century is an important moment, especially because they chose to go back to the Alamo instead of also thinking about the American Civil War, right? Because the Texas soldiers actually fight for the Confederacy. And so that isn't a usable history to memorialize. And so the Alamo becomes this public monument that helps people find a space to go and celebrate their Texas identity, but that also very specifically excludes Mexican residents from that community building. Like I said earlier, something that I thought was really interesting in this research is that Chicano activists from the 60s and 70s really used histories that they had heard from their parents and grandparents about this period of violence, that it was something that allowed them to make sense of the oppression that they were feeling, right? And so the Texas Rangers are very present in trying to bust organizing around agricultural strikes. And there's also high rates of police brutality against Latinos, not only in places like LA, but we're just thinking about Texas and San Antonio and in Houston and in El Paso. And so it became this moment, this historical moment in which these Chicano and Chicana activists could say, this history of violence has always existed and we can't let it continue, right? And then again, when you see the high rates of Mexican veterans coming home in caskets from the war in Vietnam, that they're starting to make sense of how this is a longer legacy, right? It's not a current phenomenon for them. And so in terms of thinking about, I mean, this topic has been very powerful in the classes that I taught, or in this class that I'm teaching at UT Austin, and overwhelmingly its students are angry that they didn't learn this in public education, and they're angry that it isn't part of a national consciousness. And as I spoke of earlier, for us to think about the interconnected relationship of empire and colonization and the history of slavery in the United States, and how racial tensions in the early 20th century especially boiled over in the forms of mob violence, we have to think about the ways in which state agents were implicated in these crimes, right? So if it's estimated that over 3,000 Black victims of lynchings occurred in the South, if you think about the numbers of local agents that also executed prisoners who were quote unquote, resisting arrest, that number is going to grow exponentially. And so there's a need for, not only for this to mobilize communities in the Southwest, but for people to think more critically about how this period of violence is influenced by longer histories of colonization, especially in the Southwest, right? Captain Ransom, for example, was a soldier in the Spanish-American War. And he, in some of the Texas Ranger memoirs that I found, spoke very publicly about how he learned how to treat Mexicans in South Texas by murdering indigenous communities in the Philippines, right? And so it really is connected in terms of thinking about ideas of racial supremacy and the justification of extralegal murders. It's something that was practiced on other communities and really refined in Texas by the Texas Rangers against indigenous communities in the 19th century. So, thank you for your question. Good on time. So, thank you so much, and I'll look forward to more conversation after.